Hey guys, Vlad here with AVT-Astro. So you're thinking of getting your very first telescope, or maybe you already have like a really entry-level model and you're thinking about upgrading to your first real telescope. What an exciting time. I remember when I got my first scope, it was actually a Tasco 60 mm refractor. This was like 25 years ago. It was just super exciting. I vividly remember seeing the moon for the first time. Really cool. A bit about me, just like I said, I've been into astronomy for like roughly probably about 25 years, pretty much since I was a little kid. Over the years, I've had the privilege of owning well over 100 scopes, just all kinds of fun accessories. So, what kind of inspired me to make this video and a few other videos that are kind of lean towards the entry level, person that's kind of getting into the hobby is that I volunteer a fair amount at my astronomy club. Um, and basically, and just from talking to people at star parties, and I always, kind of get questions like this of, people are wondering what type of scope they should be looking at for their first scope or their second scope, what kind of eyepieces they should be buying. So I figured instead of trying to spend like an hour with each person, I could just direct them to some of my videos and hopefully kind of point them in the right direction. So anyhow, let's get into it. Basically, I know that my title says that I'm recommending the Nexstar 6SE telescope as your first real scope. That's realistically just kind of a super, hip shot, just not knowing anything about you. Like, if you found me at a star party at 2 a.m. and I fell asleep at the eyepiece and you just woke me up, you're like, Vlad, I'm trying to buy my first telescope. What telescope should I buy? Chances are that's what I'd recommend, not knowing anything else about you. However, obviously there's no one right product for everybody, just like, with anything. So I actually just want to kind of talk about the different scope designs, what the pluses, the minuses are with them, and hopefully they'll kind of just point you in the right direction of what will work for you. So yeah, let's get into it. Basically, the first scope design that I want to talk about is the Dobsonian telescope design. Very popular. They've been around, for quite some time. They are probably the most simple scope to use from the perspective of both setting it up and just using the thing. So essentially they have two main components. They'll have the base and the tube. You just, you pluck the tube onto the base. The bases are usually made of particle board, especially on entry-level models. And then you're basically ready to start observing. So, that's kind of the first two pros that I have listed there. They're very easy to set up, very easy to observe with. Probably, like, if I had to summarize the biggest plus of the Dobsonian design is that they are inexpensive for the aperture. So in entry-level scopes, most people that I talk to, they're looking, for their first like real scope. They're looking to spend, $1,000 or less, realistically. That's kind of like, what I hear most of the time. I mean, not very many people have more than that to spend on their first, like real type of scope. And then that type of price range in a Dobsonian, if you shop around, you could pretty easily pick up a 12-inch scope, which is, that's a good amount of aperture. If you're into observing faint fuzzies such as like galaxies, star clusters, nebulas, and stuff like that, having that extra aperture, awesome. That's actually what you want. So if you're into that, that's a good way to go if you want that big aperture. No need for dew prevention. So basically, if you live in a climate that's, like not a super desert, chances are you're going to have to deal with dew at least 2 seasons of the year. So usually like fall, winter, probably early spring. Like here in the Northwest, it's a huge issue with Dobs. You don't have to deal with it because the mirror is so far down in the tube with the Dob. Assuming it's a closed tube Dob, which most of them in that price range, under $1,000, they are going to be that. Yeah, so that's pretty cool feature. So you don't have to worry about that. So the last thing that I've got listed there on the pros for Dobbs, no power required. Again, it's a totally manual scope. You just point the thing, wherever you're looking at, boom, you're good to go. So getting kind of onto the cons. So the first thing that I have listed is hard to find DSOs for beginners. So what's a DSO? Again, it's those faint fuzzies. It stands for deep sky objects, is what DSO is. So nebulas, clusters, star clusters, galaxies, stuff like that. A Dob used to be like the top recommendation for a beginner scope, like in an 8-inch or so. 20 years ago, that might have been true, especially previous to that. These days, with the amount of light pollution there is, I don't know how true that is, just because even for somebody like me that knows, the night sky pretty well, I mean, I know how to find, quite a bit of deep sky objects just, from memory without even using the star atlas. It's kind of hard to do from the city just because usually when you're finding stuff manually, you need to see, some number, like a decent number of stars that you kind of reference and get to that faint fuzzy that you can't see with your unaided eye. And from the city, it's just kind of hard to do these days. So that's the biggest downside to the Dob. The other thing is that technology has advanced. You can do things like EAA, electronically assisted astronomy, which I'll touch on a little bit more later, which basically allows you to see more with a smaller scope that's motor driven versus a bigger Dob visually. So there's a couple of things that have kind of changed over the years. So no tracking. Again, it's it's totally manual, so you're not gonna have tracking. So it's basically due to the rotation of the Earth. Anything that you put in the eyepiece of a scope, it will basically move through the field of view fairly quickly. So the downside to that, if you're observing alone, like if you're using high powers, let's say you're looking at Jupiter or something at like 200x. I mean, Jupiter is going to move through the field of view fairly quickly. So basically, you'll put in the field of view. It'll start to drift through there, and you'll have to adjust the scope to where it's it's back to in the kind of towards the center of the field of view. And at high power, you kind of have to do that fairly often. Every time you touch your scope, it's going to vibrate a little bit. So you have to wait for the vibrations to settle. So you're kind of missing out on a lot of detail due to that. It's just that uncomfort factor. If you're sharing views with your friends or family, it's pretty frustrating too, or it can be pretty frustrating at higher powers because same thing. By the time you put that object in there, you have somebody look in there. Chances are it's already kind of moved towards the edge of the field of view. It could already be gone, and you have to find it again. So it's just not as convenient. So that is a pretty big downside. Can do astrophotography. A lot of people that I talk to these days, they're not really per se looking to get into visual. A lot of people are interested, in astrophotography. If not initially, then they certainly want to get into it. With the Dob, that's totally manual. I mean, besides taking like a quick picture of the moon through the eyepiece with your cell phone or something like that, you really can't do astrophotography. So that's if you are thinking about astrophotography, pretty big downside there. The need for better eyepieces. So, I'm not going to get too much into the details of this, but basically, the faster the telescope is, f ratio wise. So basically, anything that's an f7 or faster, so an f7 or a lower number, it will need better eyepieces and wider field designs. And basically those are usually more expensive. So with a faster scope, like most Dobs are like an f5 or quicker. Basically stars in the outer field of view, they'll kind of look more like a comet instead of a pinpoint, which is why you need the more expensive eyepieces, because they're corrected for that essentially. Again, that's just a super rudimentary explanation, but they do need more expensive eyepieces. That can be a downside, especially if you want to get those wider field of view eyepieces. Harder to resell. So why would I say that? Why is it that harder to resell than other scopes? Well, if you're selling it locally, it's probably not harder to sell it. Like if you decide to upgrade to a different scope, or you want to get into astrophotography or whatever. In a lot of cases, for a lot of folks, they don't live in a city that's large enough to sell stuff locally. So if you have to sell it through the internet, like eBay or like the astronomy forums, it is harder to resell it just because they're big. It's going to cost a lot to ship it. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. Okay, so kind of just summing up Dobs. Like why would I recommend the Dob? If you're somewhere where you've got a darker sky, or if if you're gonna observe at star parties anyway, where there is typically a darker sky, you love finding stuff manually, and you just want like a bigger aperture, by all means get a Dob. They are awesome. I have a 16-inch Dob. It's amazing to use from a dark sky site. So that's the primary thing. If you want a big aperture and not spend a lot of money, get a Dob. Next up, we have refractors. It's kind of hard to hide. I do like refractors, and and basically, why is that? They're probably my favorite scope design. Why is that? Well, refractors, they just provide those really, really fine pinpoint stars. Images just look super crisp on refractors. So I really enjoy using them. So kind of going through the pros on the refractor. So the first few points that I have, they're listed with a question mark. So easy to use, fast to set up, it requires power. Same thing as the Dob. It depends on the mount that you have. If you have a manual mount for your refractor, everything that I talked about with the Dob applies to a refractor as well. If you have a go-to mount, or a mount that at least has tracking, you're not going to have to deal with that. So kind of going on to the next point, no cool down time. So anytime you bring out your scope from the inside of your house to the outside, typically it's going to be either hotter or colder outside than it is inside your house. So your telescope has to acclimate to the outside environment. While it's acclimating to the outside environment, it's not going to provide as sharp of an image. That's a super rudimentary explanation, but that's what it is. With refractors, I mean, if you have something this big, yeah, they do have a fairly long cool down time. But most refractors that are like a 3 or 4 inches, which is what most people that are getting into the hobby will kind of tend to get. The cool down time is almost non-existent. I mean, it might be like 10 minutes or something like that. So that's a really big plus. I mean, if you're somebody that doesn't have a lot of time to observe, that's a huge, huge, huge advantage. So that's really cool. Next point goes from ultra wide to high power. So what do I mean by that? Especially if let's say if you get like an 80mm short focal length refractor, you could go from like a 5.5 degree field of view with the right wide angle eyepiece, which will frame any deep sky object out there. I mean, there's really not any deep sky objects that are larger than that. And then you want to the next moment be looking at Jupiter at like 180x, you could do that. That's simply not possible with other scope designs. They just cannot go that wide of a field of view. So that's if it's pretty universal. So that's kind of a great thing to have in the scope. Good for astrophotography. If you're getting into astrophotography, like real full-blown astrophotography, and you're in that $1,000 price range, it's kind of hard to pull that off. But let's say you want to get a little 80mm refractor and save up for a mount. Yeah, it's if you talk to anybody that's into astrophotography, they will recommend starting with the refractor like 90% of the time at least. So I mean, because they have that really wide field of view, I've talked about it. They have those really pinpoint stars. It's just easier to start out with in astrophotography with those. So that's that's a consideration if you're kind of thinking of going that route. Pretty stars, so I already talked about that. So stars are just really small little pinpoints, look awesome in refractors. That's one of my favorite things about them, and it's hard to explain. It's just something that you really have to see for yourself. So kind of moving on to the cons. Hard to find deep sky objects. Again, we talked about it. Depends on the mount. If your mount's go-to, awesome. If not, then it will be hard, just like with the Dob. Although not as hard because it is a wider field of view with the refractor typically, so it might be easier. But in general, it's about the same thing. Tracking, same thing. Depends on the mount. Need for better eyepieces. Most refractors, they will be a shorter focal ratio as well. So basically the same thing that I talked about with the Dob will apply to refractors. They will have coma with less expensive eyepieces. Um, Expensive for the aperture. That's the biggest downside to refractors. As soon as you go over like a 4 inch, especially 5 inch with a refractor, they do get really expensive really quickly. So you're not getting very much aperture with them for the money. So that is a big downside. Secondary color. So if you get a refractor, this can be like a whole video on itself, so I'm not going to go deep into it. If you get a refractor that is not an APO, they will have secondary color. Basically, they'll show like a purple halo, usually around bright objects like the moon, Jupiter, bright stars, and anything that's bright in the sky. So that is a big downside. But if you get an APO, even if it's like an entry-level ED doublet, typically they are pretty good, especially for visual use. Okay, so where are we here? Okay, so I covered all the points. So in which case would I recommend a refractor? If you're kind of, really leaning towards getting into astrophotography, you think that's kind of in the future for you, refractor is a great way to start. Chances are you're probably not going to get a astrophotography quality refractor and an astrophotography quality mount, just because the mounts are usually like $1,000, that are capable of astrophotography. But it's something you can kind of work towards. Also, if you're somebody that doesn't have a lot of time to observe, like let's say you usually only have 20-30 minutes to observe, a refractor is a great way to go because they're really lightweight. They're, you just bring it into the backyard. Again, it doesn't have any cool down time. You do a little bit of observing, you bring it back inside, and you're done. You know what I mean? So they're really cool for that. Lastly, a refractor, in the sense, a smaller refractor, is kind of good to go with for your first scope because you start out with it, it's easier to use it. Again, there's no cooldown time, it's easier to find stuff because of the wider field of view. It provides crisp images, so you kind of get comfortable with it. You use it for a few years. If you're ready to step up to a bigger scope, chances are you're not going to get rid of your refractor. You'll still use it for that grab and go quick, look scope. The bigger the scope that you have, the less you're going to use it. Believe me, I have I've talked to tons of people. I know this, true for myself. Like I have this 7-inch APO. This is my least used scope because the mount to carry it is huge. The scope itself is huge. It weighs like 40 pounds. It's hard to set up. I'm not gonna set it up unless I have like a few nights probably that I'm gonna observe with it, or I just happen to have a lot of time that particular night. So something to consider. So anyhow, moving on to the last one. So SCTs, and with SCTs, there's a huge variety of them. I'm kind of more specifically talking about the Nexstar 6SE or similar models too when I'm talking about SCTs. So easy to use once you learn the electronics. Just like with any electronics, there's a little bit of a learning curve. As soon as you kind of master that, as soon as you kind of figure out how to align the thing, with these newer go-to scopes, they'll find anything in the night sky for you, which is awesome. Again, if you live in a light-polluted city, which pretty much everybody does these days, it's just so much more enjoyable to use it. It's very, very difficult to find stuff manually if you've got a light-polluted sky. So fast to set up. Those, especially the 6SE, it's so light. If you're in relatively decent physical shape, like you could grab the whole thing, tripod included it, and just bring it out the back door, and you're ready to observe like literally in minutes. So that's really amazing. Even if you have to break it down into the two components, like the tripod and the scope itself, it really doesn't take that much longer. So that's a really, really big benefit. Again, the easier the scope it is to use, the quicker you can get it outside and start observing with it, the more you're going to use it. So that's a big benefit. Easy to find deep sky objects, so I already talked about that. It's got go-to, you'll find everything automatically for you. Awesome. Tracking, it's got tracking. So, once you get it aligned, anything that it points to, it's automatically tracking it. You're gonna see more because of that, because you're not spending time to readjust it all the time. If you get to share the view with your friends, family, it's awesome. It's just there. They just come take a look. It's right there. It's not going anywhere. So awesome. So that's a big thing. You might not think it's a big thing. That's a really really big thing to have a scope have tracking. It goes from a relatively wide field to like you could use pretty much as much magnification as your atmosphere will support with even a 6-inch scope. So that's nice. It's not nearly as wide as a refractor, but it'll fit most things in the field of view. So that's pretty nice. Cheaper eyepieces work well. So since an SCT is a slower scope, it works at an f10. Most of them do. You can buy less expensive wide field eyepieces, and they'll still stars will still look pretty good even in the outer field of view. So that's something to consider. That's pretty nice. Good for EAA. So kind of touched on EAA. EAA, that's a whole different subject. I think eventually I'm gonna make a YouTube video about that too, because quite a bit of people are interested in that. Basically what it does is instead of using an eyepiece, you'll use an dedicated astronomy camera, and you'll use your laptop, and basically you use a piece of software called SharpCap, and there's a few other ones, but SharpCap is by far the most popular. And they'll actually start to it'll take short exposures with your astronomy camera, and it'll start to stack the images for you automatically. So with EAA, even with like a 6-inch scope like the 6SE, you could see more than you can with the 12-inch Dob, especially from the city, because the sensitivity of those astronomy cameras is so good that on a lot of the brighter deep sky objects, you can see them in full color. It's super awesome. I'll post a few images in here just so you can kind of see an idea, and these are just things that I've taken from my with the EAA from my backyard here. So just that's kind of a really cool benefit, and that's possible because the scope does have tracking. Your future grab and go scope. I already kind of talked about this with the refractor. The 6SE scope, it's kind of the same thing. It's small enough to where you could use it as your grab and go scope. Later on, if you upgrade to an astrophotography setup, and you've got like your refractor all rigged out for that, you got a nice mount for that. Those are typically heavy. You're not going to be able to grab that and just carry out in one go. With the 6SE, you can, so that's a pretty nice benefit. Kind of moving on to the cons, it does require power. So you can run the thing off of AA batteries. I think it takes like 8 of them. Not too big of a deal. Or you could run it from DC from your car, from AC from your wall outlet, but it does require power. You cannot use them manually, basically, whatsoever. It does require deep prevention, basically for sure, unless you live in the desert, and it's just like super arid there. The corrector plate, like that front lens on an SCT, and you can see it in the picture in the slide there. It's right, right where the opening is, where the end of the scope is. So any amount of dew will start to form on there really quick. So you have to buy a dew cap. They're pretty cheap at the minimum. And those are kind of nice to have just because they do block stray light and that type of deal. But something to consider though. You will need dew prevention with them. Requires collimation. So collimation, basically what that is aligning the optics of the scope so that it performs optimally. It's kind of intimidating for people. I talk to a lot of people, they'll have an SCT and they haven't collimated it for years because, they're just kind of scared of, doing it or whatnot. It's, once you do it a few times, it's really pretty straightforward, pretty quick to do. Typically, once the scope is collimated, unless you drop it or take it for a bumpy car ride, you're probably not going to have to recollimate it. And Dobs will require collimation too. Refractors usually never require collimation. Unless it's just like really abused. So that is kind of a downside. But again, it's not a big deal once you learn how to do it if you treat your scope right. Longer cooldown times. This is kind of a big one. With SCTs, because it's a closed tube design, it's physically pretty big around. The light actually goes through an SCT tube 3 times. It is more affected by cooldown than other scope designs. Like if you're looking at the 6SE, particular like a 6-inch version, the cooldown time isn't too bad. Usually it's like 20-30 minutes, like maybe an hour if the temperature swing is really long, but it's definitely longer than an SCT and a DOB because a DOB is an open tube design. So that is a downside to SCTs. Stars are not as pretty, so we're back to the pretty stars. So with SCTs, there's a bunch of different factors that affect this, but stars typically will not look as fine pinpoint as they do, let's say, in a refractor or even in a good, decent DOB. So it's just kind of how it is. A lot of it has to do with that cool down time, and it's just a long subject to kind of cover everything. So yeah, so we kind of ran through all the scope designs that are pretty popular. So why do I recommend, I guess, the Nexstar 6SE? It just covers a lot of the bullet points that you might want to have in your first scope. Again, it's got that tracking that's huge. You can find objects automatically, that's huge. If you want to get into some really entry astrophotography, you can do that with it. You'd have to get a wedge. But really for EAA and EAA is just a lot easier to do than actual astrophotography. It's awesome for that. And you'd actually be surprised at how good of images you could get with EAA these days. So, yeah, I think, for a lot of folks, it just covers a lot of bullet points. But again, just use your best judgment as to what'll work, best for you. If you're in the larger city, look up if you've got an astronomy club. Chances are you do. If you guys have an astronomy club in your city, by all means go to some star parties. If you're interested in a particular scope, whether it be the 6SE or whatever scope, talk to people out there. Like astronomy folks at like our club, they're like some of the most awesome people that you'll meet. Super friendly. They're all willing to help you out. So yeah, talk to people, especially if they have a lot of experience with the type of scope that you're interested in. They have the type of scope that you're interested in. Hook up with them at a star party. Look through the scope. If you're more into astrophotography, believe me, you for sure want to talk to somebody that has kind of gone through it and knows what they're doing. But yeah, if you've got any questions that are specific to a specific setup, you're kind of considering like a specific scope and you just want an opinion on it, feel free to shoot me an email. Leave me a comment in the video. Yeah, I'll be glad to help you out, and good luck choosing your first scope. Bye.